Unplugged my.
Hi. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Good morning for those who are joining us here from the United States or this side of the world. And good evening for those who are in Asia. Good afternoon for those who are in Africa. I know that some of you are, everybody's joining from different parts, and good afternoon for those who are in Europe as well. Today is a special day. We are here with Dr. Maria Lahman. Today we have an exciting topic. We'll be having a conversation on research ethics. And I want to welcome back those who attended the last two sessions. Today is the third session. And we have the fourth one coming up a month from now. I shall communicate with you probably a week or so before the session itself. We are really delighted to have so many great experts on qualitative research to talk to us. Dr. Maria Lahman is a qualitative methodology professor at the University of Northern Colorado in the state of Colorado here in the US. Her research emphasis areas include the enhancement of ethical and culturally responsive qualitative research and aesthetic research representation. I must say that when it comes to ethics in qualitative research, we cannot really leave culture out. They kind of go hand in hand. Maria is the author of 2 textbooks and the forthcoming one, which is an introduction to qualitative research with Sage Publications. Maria lives with her spouse and 2 children in Greeley, Colorado, with a flock of urban hens. That's a good one. If she ever has free time, she uses it to garden, read, write, and cook. And I want to say that Maria is not, is not a new friend as far as I'm concerned. Even for those who are members of the Asian Qualitative Research Association, will definitely recall her because she visited us as a keynote speaker in the Philippines back in 2018. Was it? I don't know, 2018, something like that. Either 2018 or 2019. No, it was 2019, I think, because that was my last conference in the Philippines before I moved out. So I know it was in 2019. So she traveled all the way there from Colorado to the Philippines to be the keynote speaker at the Qualitative Research Conference there. That's where we first met. And ever since, we have been in touch, collaborating on certain activities. And she invited me to be a guest on her platform, and today she's speaking on this platform. So it's just wonderful to have somebody who is willing to share her knowledge. She's a prolific author. She has several publications, and one I always want her to talk about is ethics, because we don't have a whole lot of people who love to talk about ethics. And so let's get started. I'm going to start with some questions, and for those who are in the audience, please post your questions there on Facebook. I will try to get to those that come up. I'll go with first come, first served. So when we finish the questions I have prepared for Maria, we'll go to those that we have on Facebook. So if you have a question, you want it to be answered, post that as quickly as possible. So let's get started with the questions that I have prepared for you. Dr. Maria, why is ethics so important in social science research in general? I think let's start with that big umbrella.
Yeah, and Safari, first I want to thank you so much for inviting me. This is such a great opportunity, and I really appreciate how international the reach of your group is. One of the things I've always enjoyed about working with Safari is we talk about our children. And as soon as this session started, I noticed my son had unplugged my computer. So that's why I had to black out, scramble around, get mom plugged back in. And so now I'm all set, best plans laid. You never know what your kids are going to do. So anyways, so moving on to the idea of ethics. I really got very formally involved with research ethics through what the US calls the IRB. But in this session, we'll think of it as the Research Ethics Board, because of course the IRB, I've always thought very oddly, is missing the word ethics. So we'll think of it more like REB. And the reason I did that is when I came to my university, the specialty on the research ethics board was quantitative. And so people were really checking your research and acting like if it was qualitative, maybe it wasn't ethical. And so we needed more insight. And they immediately said, okay, great, here's someone that will do that, because they needed working hands. And I moved, maybe, I want to say my second year, to being one of the chairs of the research ethics board, which usually doesn't happen. So I was able to be at the background and also as someone submitting my research. The very first thing I ever submitted as a professor was a study of kindergarten culture, and you had just talked about culture. And one of the reviewers said, "What is culture in kindergarten? Drinking drinking Kool-Aid out of a wine glass?" And I thought, uh-oh, we've got an uphill road here. However, I think the important piece for me is we need to always turn that around and know I need to be part of this community, because what is so important about it is there is so much power in research. And so we have this huge history of unethical research. There's been a little debate in the literature, do we always need to kind of recycle that history? And I feel very strongly we do, because if we get removed from that, then we really risk perpetrating more unethical research. And we know we're not completely out of that. And so the US is a great example. When the world realized that we were having the unethical, and really we need a much stronger word than that, research with the Nazis, the US said, well, these are barbaric people, we would never do that. And we found out our doctors do that, the government did that, researchers with hospitals did that. And so this is not something that anybody as a human with power is unfortunately removed from. And so even if we're doing the most benign research, when we take on that mantle of researcher, there's so much power with that. That's why it's so important. And the amazing thing about research is it's still every day. If you go and say to someone, would you do this in-depth study with me? Every day I'm amazed that people will say yes. And you think, why would they do that? They're not even necessarily getting any money or anything. So it's just a really amazing and fascinating area.
Yeah. And yet there are so many ramifications of ethics, depending on the obviously on the culture, depending on the participants, the geographic location, the national identity, national culture, and whether people are educated or not educated, illiterate or not literate, people in the city, people in the remote areas. That it's something that people should not get to the level of just writing, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to just remove the names and that's it. Now you can approve my ethics review application, the board application. We really have to put a lot of thought in this from what you have just said. Yeah. Okay, let's zero on qualitative research. Why should we especially care about ethics in the qualitative research? We have just looked at the bigger picture, but now zeroing in on qualitative research, I always feel like it's a lot more serious with qualitative research than, let's say, quantitative research.
Yeah, and so we know with certain kinds of quantitative research, people could literally have their body physically hurt. So we have that. But when we move to qualitative, definitely qualitative research has historically and could potentially have psychological ramifications. Then the other thing that's really fascinating about it is we have the research design of in-depth interview with one person. And so when we do an in-depth interview with one person and report on one person, that becomes the most identifiable type of person in the research. And so I think, so picture now we're interviewing someone about a vulnerable topic, one person, and we do a case of one. This is someone that can almost be completely identifiable. And it's interesting, we're starting to have groups that want us to be able to completely access their data. So in the United States, some of the federal organizations, if you receive a grant, you have to completely access the data. So I think they're going to need to put out some examples for qualitative of what they consider a confidential transcript that you would put up. Because for example, the example I always give is one time, one of my students was studying a Taiwanese USA provost And so in my mind, that was probably just a couple people in the whole country. Now, we said that our responsibility was to say to the provost, you know, you'll be identifiable. And he said, well, he didn't care. But this person becomes completely identifiable. So what did he do? Pull the demographic that's so important, that he's Taiwanese. It was huge that he had come from Taiwan and was now at the rank of provost. So it's just a really fascinating area.
You know, that relates to one of the issues that we find in, for example, direct quotes. You know, you have just mentioned one area where we, you know, where we have breaking the rules. Basically, we're breaking the rules of confidentiality and so on, where the person actually decides to reveal his or her own identity. But there are issues that come with the direct quote, which we'll come back to. But I wanted you to share a little bit more about the proximity that we have with qualitative research participants. That may not necessarily be the relationship that we have when we are administering, for example, a survey in qualitative research. We spend quite some time interacting with the person, which raises a little bit more the potential for ethical problems than when I ask somebody, you know, fill up this form, it'll take 10 minutes, this survey, it will take 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, put it in the brown envelope. That's what we always say. And then you just leave, and I'm going to leave the room. You know, I don't have to be here. Can you address that a little bit more? How we should plan for this as we plan our qualitative research?
Yeah, and let's maybe move from the example of an interview. So the dominant form of qualitative is what we think of as a one-shot interview. And so we could have a whole nother discussion on whether that should be the dominant form. But let's say I was going to do an on-site case study or an ethnography. I had an early example where I would keep being at this elementary school, and I would run into colleagues from the university whose children were there, and they'd say, oh, are you, they knew I didn't supervise student teachers. They would say, oh, are you here for this or that? And I'd say, no. And then after about a month, one said, I know why you're here. And so I was there to do research. And so I don't have, I didn't have the right, because of confidentiality, to say, oh, I'm doing an ethnography in the first grade class, because the school was going to be anonymous and the children were going to have pseudonyms and such. But as educated other researchers, they started to realize that, well, then I also had a colleague's child in the class. So you get these kind of layered situations. And fortunately, in that case, there was nothing sensitive that occurred. But we all know when you're in a classroom, there could have been something sensitive that occurred that a parent might have thought, ooh, I'm not super comfortable to have a colleague in that class. So it brings up a lot of things at that level. And then when you do in-person research with adults, let's say you were going to a study, a lot of my students have studied recreation centers, for example. There's all sorts of boundary crossing that you have to think about, like where do you draw the line at? I had a situation where I presented myself to 4 different kindergarten teachers in the same way, and I was studying all their classes the same year, and I thought, how interesting, they all kind of interpreted me differently. And so you have to be really clear, and it's good to get other people to check on the way you introduce yourself. So I said, I wanted to participate fully. So I said, you can have me do anything in the classroom. I can run reading groups, clean, whatever, as long as I'm around children. Because I'm a former kindergarten teacher, and I didn't want to be at the office making copies or doing a bulletin board. I needed to be around the kids. Well, one teacher was new, and she definitely interpreted me as like a teacher supervisor. And so we had a very different relationship. And so I would almost kind of dress down, like below the level she dressed at. Whereas if I had gone in my teacher supervisor role, I would have worn very high level clothes. So there's just, you want to be more casual, share your power, and then think very clearly about what kind of boundaries you need to draw. Because for some adults I've supervised, even one of them met his wife at a research site. In my opinion, the second you want to date someone at a research site, you stop researching them.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so that's my opinion on that. But there's a lot of discussion in the sociological ethics research that doesn't agree with me. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maria. You have pointed at a number of issues there that lead me to think about creativity, and we promote creativity a lot in qualitative research because we'll always come across certain things that were never probably in the textbooks. That you really have to be creative in addressing the ethics. For example, for you in your case, you had to kind of blend in with the student, with the teacher, so that students, can be familiar with you. I just discovered, I just had the similar experience a few months ago. I was collecting data in the Philippines. This is a massive study I'm working on, and I wanted to observe. And observing in the Philippines, it means I'll be the only Black person in the class. Even if I say I'll be silent observation, the fact that there's one person here who's a total stranger, it will alter people's behaviors. So I was trying to find out, I had a plan that I was going to observe, but when time came to collect the data, and that's the beauty of qualitative research, I can change certain things on the way. I said, you know what? I think I'm going to request. I discovered that a number of the professors that I wanted to observe, they had taught on Zoom or Google Meet or something. Yes. They had the recordings of their lessons.
Such a good idea.
I just decided to ask them to send me recordings because that is authentic material that is not affected by my presence. So we have to be very creative, but we just have to take some time to think about these things because it's not something that we just jump on just like that. I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
Well, your situation, you would often be perceived as though you're evaluating someone. So when you come in that way, you also don't fit the racial ethnic profile they're used to. It seemed like, who is this? Is someone evaluating? And so if you had the time, which I know you didn't, you would stay for weeks, which is why ethnography kind of ends up being the hallmark. But people would settle down, we believe, to their more typical behavior, but it still would be altered.
It will. And yet, that comes at a certain level of an ethical practice, especially if they perceive you as being in a supervisory role, or somebody who can, who have power over the participants. Right there, there's an unintentional coercion, and that is not ethical when we look at it. Okay, let's go to that.
The other thing you brought up there, we could just talk about briefly, is technology. So technology has just brought such new dimensions to our research, and so it brings its own set of ethical issues. I'll go around and drop in this conversation after we talk AOIR's, I won't get the full acronyms, ethical outline. It's excellent. And so it was a grassroots movement early when we started to do more on the internet, and it helps guide people through choices specifically for technology.
That's correct. That's right. Let's go to another question. By the way, I want to welcome all the people. I see that people are mentioning that the different countries are joining from India, Australia, so Philippines, and the US. Welcome from all those different countries. Let's go to another question. This is getting exciting, but I don't want to run out of time. I want to still save some time for questions. So those who have questions, please don't forget to put them there. What are some of the challenges that you have seen commonly faced, either for you as a researcher or for your students when they are either planning or conducting qualitative research?
I think the one that will come to students' mind first, and certainly some colleagues, is thinking about the research ethics board process. And unfortunately, it's somewhat localized, and so each country and then each institution has their own way they interpret that. But the point I want to make is try very early to understand what that process will be. And so hopefully there's clear information on your institution's website. If not, try and speak to other students that have gotten through that. If you have an advisor that pays attention to that, which they don't all, try and see what their advice is, and work in these processes early. So even as finely tuned as I felt like my university's was, I'm not directly on that board anymore. We had someone leave. And so as soon as someone left, we got this kind of backlog of research. So as much as possible, get your work in early so you have your IRB approval, your research ethics board approval early, and pay attention to all the detailed questions they're asking you. And then the reason I particularly want to emphasize this for us as qualitative researchers is most of the infrastructures are set up asking more like biomedical or quantitative psychological questions. And so I just had a student it's a dissertation, and it's an incredible dissertation, but the research participant after the first in-depth interview will choose, do they want to do a mobile photo interview? So they would take photos of their campus and then walk around with the researcher discussing it, a beautiful methodology, or a collage, or create research poetry. So you can see for the IRB, well, what are these 3 avenues? Everyone needed a set of directions that the IRB could see what it is. And so the student did very clear work early days and got the research ethics board approval pretty quick. So I think that's the first one. But related to that, I think the issue we have then is a novice or an early career researcher feels like, okay, research ethics is done. And once we get our research ethics board approval, it has only started, because half the time we'll pretend I'm not being recorded. I'm very glad people don't know what actually goes on in the field, because when you go in the field, you cannot anticipate everything that's going to happen. A great example, a student told me, he doesn't think of himself as a very old man, but he was interviewing an 18-year-old. And when he got there, she had had a car wreck. And she cried on his shoulder, did not know where any of her paperwork was for her car. He got it all out, handled all her insurance. Well, when they were done, certainly she didn't want to do an interview, so he left, but she was so grateful, she did a follow-up interview. Well, nobody has covered that in research ethics, how to handle when you arrive and your students had a car wreck. So the humanity of it is foreshadowed, that always takes the front. I love his story because it's such a good example and it had a good outcome. But then he had an amazing interview because she was so appreciative. So the humanity will always take the forefront, and the researcher is right behind that, I think. So
thank you so much for that illustration, and especially your emphasis on the concept of humanity. This is a concept that I emphasize a lot in my teaching, qualitative research teaching, and also qualitative research training, that I think one of the reasons why I am sold to qualitative research, I'm not against quantitative research, but I'm sold to qualitative research, is the humanity aspect of it. It makes us much more humans. It requires us to be much more human than what is expected of us from quantitative research. And so as a human, as a good human being, what would I do? That has to always be part of us when we're conducting research, or when we are planning research study. What is the most humanizing practice that I can use in this specific context? Very, very well done. The other thing that I wanted to add here is, especially for students who are applying for ethics review board, a number of times that I have seen, right now my job, part of my job is to help students with the research, doctoral students with the research, and that is having things in mind but not written on paper. If they would talk about it, they can actually talk about it, but when you look at their application, these things are not there. And what I always tell students is that anything that you think about, please put it there, because the people who are the committee that's going to read your work don't have access to what you're thinking about unless you put it in writing.
Yeah, kind of the test for that is someone that doesn't even know you should be able to pick up that application and go and do your study. And so to keep checking, is that information actually there? And you're exactly right, it often isn't.
Yes. What would you say, this is a follow-up question, what would you say about an institution, let's say university, that has no ethics review board? What recommendation can you make for that university? Because I know some. I was pleasantly surprised, not pleasantly surprised. I was surprised. I was shocked. But what recommendation can you make for such universities?
Yeah, and I'll probably give you too long of an answer. So for the forthcoming textbook, I was updating the ethics section, and the US federal government keeps a list of all the countries that have an ethics board, and it has increased dramatically since I wrote the initial text on research ethics, which I think is a 2018. The piece, kind of the sub piece that we can't solve here that I don't particularly like about it is sometimes the ethics board concept feels like it's a type of colonization, in the sense that it's a Western way of thinking about ethics. And you know, my work looks heavily at culturally responsive. In fact, the ethics textbook is trying to look at cultural responsivity. And so all countries have the way they think about ethics. But what kind of happened is, since these Western countries jumped in after World War II with the Nazis, it was almost set up like this is the way to be ethical. And so the big issue, of course, is always the difference between the US being a highly autonomous country and other countries not having more like a kinship over autonomy. And so I always worry that one set of ethics is seen as superior then. And I think other countries adopt this for two reasons. We have this training mechanism already. Senior scholars receive degrees in a Western country, and monies are held up from global grants. So you have these high stakes things like, well, what's your infrastructure? And so I just always want to be clear that local ethics, I think, are paramount over Western senses of autonomy. And so somehow if we could create like a blended research ethics board, I think that's the best idea. Anyways, back to, what did you actually ask me, Safari? Good grief.
Thank you so much for clarifying
I don't
that.
think
And it is true that, as you said, each country will have their own practice of ethics.
I know.
I don't think that ethics is necessarily a Western concept. Although the interpretation or the application of the acceptable ethical practices may vary from one country to another, and that's the next question I had for you. How do you deal with this? What challenges do we face? What are the common issues when we are conducting a study in different countries than our own country? Although the ethical expectations may be different, but ethics is ethics, no matter where we are.
Yes, absolutely.
I remember in the study that I'm completing now, that how here in the US we say that if I'm recruiting somebody and that person has the power to give consent, I just go straight to that person if I got already the permission from the institution and everything. But I discovered something that I learned in the Philippines. It's good to go with somebody who's in supervisory role who will actually choose the participants. I had to go with that. And I reported that. I reported that in my report, that, hey, this is the culturally acceptable way of recruiting. I did not initially, I planned to do it the Western way, but no, the Western way was not acceptable. I had to go through this, and I found that everybody was happy that they were invited by their supervisor or the vice president for research, the director of research. And at first it was uncomfortable, but I found that that's how it worked, and I have to go with that. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I don't think I answered your direct question. So if you don't have a research ethics board process, and we've even had this here with the local community college, they didn't have it necessarily set up. I would look to see specifically for a consent form what the components of consent are. So for example, let's say you're an independent researcher in the United States, you don't technically have to follow the research ethics board because you don't receive federal money. But I would look at the components of the consent form. They're online, accessible in many, many places, and follow those, because when you go to publish, even if you're an ethical researcher, if you don't have that material documented between you and the research participants, when you go to publish your research articles, your research books, those kinds of things, you'll get pushback that you need to have documented that you established that ethical relationship. So even even like, let's say I have a student that says, well, I'm going back to be a professor in my country and we don't have a process for this. One thing you could do is be a leader in setting that up, because you're going to be the most recently trained person, but then also you can still follow it on your own. There's no reason that you can't just establish that document trail, I guess. But yes, and that's where one of the biggest ones we have is some countries do not sign consent forms. And I think a lot of that comes from kind of this patriarchal, litigious society where people will litigate. And so it's the university kind of protecting itself. And so we'll have situations where students will explain to me, I had it in US punk music culture where they said, hey man, you're my friend. Why am I signing this thing? So it made them worried. And I had this in other countries where they said, are you part of the CIA? Why would I ever sign this? You know? And so they had to kind of have a discussion around that. And so fortunately, most universities have follow-up ways that you can do a recorded consent or a witnessed consent. And I've written quite a bit about different levels of that. The US, even though we're very used to signing a consent, has some cultures where religiously they don't sign forms like that. And so we had always had this kind of process that you could get consent in other ways. Witness consent ideally would be witnessed if it was something about stigmatizing or illegal, like let's say you're interviewing undocumented people. Ideally, it would be witnessed by another person from the research population, because the more researchers that witness it, the more people know that the person is in an area that's illegal. So it's very sensitive.
Wow. And so I think at this point, the bottom line that we can get from all these great illustrations you have given us and, you know, personal experiences that you've had, we really have to go and abide by the ethical practices of the country, of the context where we are, because they will vary. I can relate to some of the things you have said. You know, somebody said, I remember I was conducting this study in another country, it was in Africa, and I was trying to read this. It was in a phone interview. I said, I'm going to get your consent. As soon as I started reading the informed consent statement, I said, don't waste my time. Let's go to the real thing.
Yes.
I said, so in the end, I just said, okay, I just summarize it. I say, you give, you know, consent and voluntary participation. I say, yes, I do. And then we started that. So, you know, we should be flexible. As long as we are not compromising the ethical practices or ethical expectations or ethical standards of the context where we are conducting this study. I think that's the bottom line. Yes, please go ahead.
Well, and a great example, one of my specialty areas is children. And so, for example, I think in my research career, we changed the language with children where you ask the child first in the United States. You say, your parents said that you can be in this study, but do you want to be? So see, the child can say they don't want to be. And so when you look at, when you said Africa, it made me think about this. When you look at certain countries, and one of them I had read about was an African country, you would ask an elder, and the concept, when they would say, well, we need to ask the child, the concept was kind of like there wasn't a good communication. Like, I don't understand that. And so I think you want to stay with the spirit of that. So let's say the child's parent or some elder around them says they can be in the study, then you would be with the spirit of that. If you realize this kid really doesn't want to be in this study, there's no reason you have to research them. So you can stay with the spirit of what the research ethics board is, because if you were an African student at a US university, you do have to follow, there's policies. So you're kind of caught between these two worlds. So I think I always advise the students, stay with the spirit of it to the extent you can, understanding the local culture, and never, you know, we're never looking down on a local culture. Everybody has their own way of thinking through ethical issues that I do agree fundamentally are the same at the core.
Thank you so much. Let's go to another question. Removing, and I had kind of made reference to this earlier, removing participants' names for privacy or confidentiality is not enough in qualitative research. Readers can still guess the identity of the participants. What else should we do in this case?
Yeah, and you know, a related issue that could almost be more problematic is misattribution. So the person thinks they know who it is, or what university it is, and they're wrong.
Yeah.
I had that once where I was at a defense thinking that the data had been collected at my university. I just had this assumption from something. And then one of the faculty said to me, you know, sideways, Maria, it's not our university. And I thought, oh, I was totally and I shouldn't have known what the university was anyways. I was just doing misattribution out of a habit, I guess. And so we do that. And one time I was teaching a narrative class, and we do a end of the semester research evening where everybody presents. And so the students had each studied one student, and they were presenting about these students' experiences. And one of the administrators at the presentation said, I recognized each and every one. Well, first off, I don't know why they said that, but then secondly, there's no way they could have. So I think there was some misattribution because each student, you know, their story had specific things, but we had worked hard to take some of the demographics that were more unique. So for example, one of the people was a white European from a very specific country. She was the only one on the whole campus from that country. And so we took that demographic and we changed and said that she was European. We didn't say the name of that country. Now, in the methodology section of the paper, we put some people's specific country of origin. This study was about international students, is not mentioned due to confidentiality issues. So you can always take the demographic and broaden it out or aggregate it. But I agree, it can become where you're feeling a little concerned about it because the data is so rich, so you don't want to lose richness of the data. Yet, if the student is in this example with students, if they're in a situation where they're talking about their advisor or something in a research study, that's problematic. And so I think the best thing to do is always go check and see, do they understand that they are possibly identifiable? Do they have any of the data that they're concerned about? And so it's kind of a process ethics. In my work, I talk about having a relational process ethics where it's not one and done, but you check back at different points. And then ultimately, you can ask them if they'd like to use their real name. Because if there is something that isn't too sensitive, some people, particularly from certain cultures, really prefer to use their own name because they feel like their story is part of who they are.
Yeah. Now on that last one, I have the principle. Please help me if this makes sense to you, that if somebody requests that their name or the name of the research setting, in this case could be a university, is something that is going to benefit them, and they want you to put that there, that's the principle I go by. If it is something that's going to empower the participant or the research, their setting, it's not something that's going to cause them harm. And by doing that, I'm not going to compromise the trustworthiness of my study. Then I feel that I can do that. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with it. We can use real names if the person wants to. And what we started to see when I was working with the Research Ethics Board, 20 some years ago, is certain groups, and this sounds like a little bit of a generalization. So for example, African Americans would sometimes say, I want to have that as part of my story. And so there wasn't this kind of white litigation, always worrying about everything sense. It was more like, this is my story. And so you don't want to be in a position where you're taking someone's story and they can't use their actual name. Another piece with that is maybe they would like to use a version of their name. So like their handle or something like that, but they still need to know that they're usually identifiable through that. If they're using it in social media, you can still track that down usually. And so I've always been a proponent for using real names if there's a reason. If the person is, but as a researcher, we know the power of once something's published, it's there forever. So if they're involved in anything that maybe they're talking about a boss, or it would have any kind of monetary repercussions, or there can be developmental repercussions. They're a younger person and don't understand the impact later in their life. So there's these different areas of repercussions that you have to help them think through. That's the main thing, I think.
Thank you so much. I came across something, I don't remember, as you were sharing, it just came to my mind. The author was saying, I don't remember where I read that. The author was saying that some minority groups are against this confidentiality of removing the names because it perpetuates the oppression of their voice not being heard. That they really want their names to be there so that their names, their voice can be heard. So again, these are the things that we have to think about. It's not just about removing the name. It's a whole lot of things that are involved, especially when we're doing qualitative research. Okay, we have only 9.
That made me think of, I think of too many things. So I have a sub area of methodological work on pseudonyms. And so one thing we really want to think about, and I'm speaking directly to white people, is when you do a pseudonym, you need to not anglicize the names. And so we have this history of taking someone's name and changing it, let's say their name's Alberto and I change it to Robert or something. And so the best thing to do, if we are going to go the pseudonym route, ask the person what kind of pseudonym they would like. Now they might anglicize their name. I've had children name themselves after Ariel the mermaid. So you have to be open to what they're going to do. But the best idea is since we're qualitative, we're right there with them, ask them what name they'd like to use for the pseudonym.
Wow, that's amazing. These are things that I've never even thought about. Interesting, and it can be quite complex when you have too many participants. I can see that when you have like 6, 7, 20, 10, maybe up to 15 participants. But it's a study that is a massive study, and you have more people.
That's different.
That becomes a challenge. All right. Let's go to your books. We have only 17 minutes to go. I see that we have one question here, but before we go to that, let's talk about your books. Can you tell us about your qualitative research book, the ethics book, that so that people know about this one and maybe they can get information about that?
Yeah, and if your library, if your institution has a subscription to SAGE Methods, it is in there now. So that would be one way to get it more affordably through your institution. And of course, some institutions even let students request a text, so you could get it through your library perhaps. And I do know that it's gone into more secondary markets out of the Western market from where I write from. So, because getting access to that kind of thing is always tricky. But the main contribution this textbook has is all of the social science research ethics books. We review the history, we talk about current practices, considerations. And what I tried to do here is also add that you as a researcher should consider doing what I call aspirational ethics. So what could you aspire to above and beyond what are the minimal procedural ethics that the research community requires for you to be in good standing? And so I have a set of questions, activities for you to go through as you think about creating that. And then I put forward my research ethics stance that I've developed with colleagues that I call culturally responsive research ethics. It really drew heavily on Ellis's early work on relational ethics, and I'll put the reference in for that later. Carolyn Ellis, the mom of autoethnography, of course, has this incredible article where she told about different things that she did that she wasn't sure she would do that way again. In this article, Relational Ethics, I think it's from her dissertation where she studied fisher folk. And so that was really pivotal for me. And then I wanted to also bring to it the idea of reflexivity and responsivity, so that when you enter, even when you enter your own culture again, you're often more, it depends on your culture, but you're often more highly educated than your culture. So you still will sometimes be out of step. So don't assume just because it's your near culture that you'll be right in step. So you have to have reflexivity with that also. And so how can you have this set of tenets as you move forward into that, so you're ready to, one of them, for example, is cultural humility. So you're ready to humbly enter the research relationship so that the person you're researching can have the utmost dignity within that relationship.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you have prepared the resources that you want to share. I will, once you share that, I will share them on Facebook for those who are watching this. And by the way, if you want to get the title of her book, or the ethics book, that is what I put on the flyer. So if you go back to the flyer for this session, you'll see it there. Let's go to the last question, and then we'll take the questions from the audience. I have 2 questions ready from the audience. What other books other than the ethics book? What other books or articles do you have out there that you would want to share with us so that people are aware of this?
Yeah, so I think maybe a year ago had a text come out on writing qualitative research. And so it covers all areas of writing, from dissertations to articles to the really creative forms like poetry and autoethnography. And so I know this is still in a massive Western market. In my own Facebook group, I'm going to start delivering some talks on that. And I'd be glad to come back here someday down the road and do that also. Because as we know, it's one thing to get the data and then get the study written for a class or something, but that leap to publishing, and this group is so fortunate to have Dr. Safari, because this is a specialty area of his. It's one of the first ways I met his work, and I thought, this is so interesting. We have such a similar mindset, because there's a practical aspect to that that must be made transparent. And sometimes we work so cerebral. It's like, what are we doing here? I need the next steps. And so that book tries to provide that. And also organizational ideas for when you get very depressed because it's just you and your computer. And then the other forthcoming text I'm very excited about. It's an introductory text. So that was a huge amount of work, but I wanted to think about, with so many introductory texts, what is a contribution I could bring? And so what it does is, in the chapter, for example, where I talk about material data, what sometimes we call documents, records, I found out that some Indigenous people really dislike the word artifacts. And as soon as I heard that, that made sense to me, because it's this idea, you pillaged our stuff, you went and put it in a museum, now you're charging us to see it. So when we use it as a researcher in a different way, it has that sense that we're tied to. And so that whole chapter features Indigenous researchers, while I'm also teaching you about how to do material data collection. The interview chapter features, well, how would we study children? Another chapter features people like homeless people. And so each chapter is trying to feature different areas of culturally responsive research while teaching you about introduction ethics. So you can imagine this was a huge task, and we'll figure out if I did it okay or not.
Wow. Fantastic. It's I'm always amazed how you are able to break things down, but also bringing the humanity into your publications, Dr. Maria. I know we both share the breaking down things, making sure that they are practical and easy to understand, but you always, I think you must have liked poetry, because you know, you bring in humanity much better than I do with my publications. So thank you so much.
I don't know if I agree, but that means a lot to me that you say that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's go to the questions from the audience. The first one comes from Dr. Ariel Ramos, who is a good friend of mine from Cebu City. You have been to Cebu, Dr. Maria. We were together there. So
and I think Dr. Ariel was in my group sometimes.
Oh, there you go. He's basically he's 2 hours from Cebu, where we were at the conference. He says, is it, and I'm putting it here so that you can see it on the chat area there. Is it ethical to include a certain degree of deception when dealing with sensitive aspects of a subject's behavior, just to triangulate information when doing qualitative studies? This is definitely something that is out there, I know, but I'll hear from you, the expert.
Okay, I want to see the second half.
Yeah.
So one thing that's interesting about when you're a research ethics board chair, the best ones don't just think about what their niche area does. So for example, I know that I'm personally not comfortable with deceptive research, so I'm not a great person to do that. But we have learned so much from researchers that do deceptive research. And so we have what we consider really big deception. So people might not even know you're a researcher, and some research ethics boards maybe or might not let you do that, but we have a huge history of that. Or smaller deceptions are in psychological research all the time. And the way that's handled, of course, is in a qualitative study, they would say, this is the construct we're studying, and I'm going to do a debrief once the study's done. And then the person learns completely about what was going on. But usually the construct that's explained is a larger one, not the exact specific one. Because let's say if I said, I'm studying gendered relationships in small spaces, well, then everybody gets tense and they're thinking about gender. So maybe instead they say, I'm studying socialization. But the person knows, and they sign that they'll find out about that later.
Mm,
If the question is more about when we go into a site, not revealing every single thing we're interested in, I think it's okay in the sense that people will say to me, well, what are you here studying? And I'll say, oh, I'm studying how kids interact with each other in the classroom. I don't have to specifically every time say I'm studying gendered interaction. So if the person wanted to dig in more and more, I'm certainly never, I guess let's get down to my answer is saying withholding some information is different than lying. So deception is not the same as lying. So I would not personally say something that was not true. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, yes.
But it'll all come back to what your research ethics board allows you to do.
On this one, there's a ramification, and I have come across this somewhere, but I want to know your perspective on this, that there may be studies, I can think of an example right now, where if you reveal that you were conducting a study, people were really not, they will just shut up the door. And so you end up conducting the study, people not knowing that, but you are required ethically after you're done to reveal what has been happening. So you're running the risk of people saying, you know what? Okay, fine, you can use the data, or no.
Yeah.
No, I don't want you to use this data. What is your take on that?
And for me, if someone withdraws data, I'm going to allow them to withdraw it. And so some people interpret that differently, saying at the point that they say, I don't want to be in the study anymore, you couldn't take more data, but they couldn't withdraw the data. So that's interpreted differently. I thought of it's a reverse thing I'd like to say to what you're saying is, I think oftentimes people will let us into sensitive places to do research that we think they might not. So, I mean, the United States hate group, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, they've let researchers join. I saw this lovely study, and I can never find it, where two researchers were going to join a survivalist group, so hardcore militia. And so they just signed up, paid their money, and got a couple guns and went there with their car. The people immediately realized that they weren't survivalists. And so they took them around all weekend and were like, hey, this is these two professors that are really interested in us, and they had a great time and they learned a ton of stuff. And so they were nervous for a minute, but they just didn't have the hardcore information to infiltrate it, even though they had permission to. And so I think oftentimes we don't necessarily have to be as deceptive as we think we do.
Yeah. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can understand how complex this whole thing is. Each context has its own reality. Again, I firmly believe that in qualitative research, dealing with ethics is much more complex than when we're dealing with the quantitative research. We are going to the last question, and that comes from a good friend of mine and colleague from the city of Puerto Princesa in the Philippines, Mr. Lino Cabrera. He's asking what steps should be taken for the safety of our participants. I think that's a very good. By the way, we have a chapter on that in the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research in the Asian Context. Mr. Lino, if you want more details on that, because we will just take only like 2-3 minutes to address this, but if you want to really dig deep, you may want to read that chapter. But go ahead, Dr. Maria.
And do you think he's, by safety, is he literally meaning physical safety or confidentiality?
I believe so. So. But let's address the physical and probably the psychological.
Yeah. I just think this idea of process responsiveness in ethical research. So it's not like they've written the consent form, we're done. Because we have to remember, we understand what we're entering into to the extent possible. A research participant, it could well likely be the only time they've been in a study. They don't necessarily understand that. And so I've had women I've interviewed who said, oh my goodness, I was amazed at how emotional I got about that. I didn't think I would be, because it happened 20 years ago. And so then I need to take the time to make sure, do they have the resources? If they want to follow up with a therapist, for example, do I have a free hotline that people would want to call, things like that. And so you want those types of things established ahead of time and not be bumbling around about that. So usually we would ask that if you're going to do a sensitive area, that you have different hotlines and groups set up that you could share if you realize that someone's having emotional distress. And then I'm fortunate. I don't do a lot of research where the person could have physical distress. I think about it a little bit on the researcher's side, because sometimes the researcher is going into spaces that I worry, like, are they completely safe? And so from the researcher, you can always take compatriot with you. So someone else can go with you, which is really helpful. But on the research side, that kind of research is so important, but I don't have as much experience with it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Maria, for sharing all this information with us. We have learned so much. I have personally learned a lot. And I want to thank the audience for being with us today. But just so that people know, the book I was referring to, this is the book that was published last year. And if your library doesn't have a copy, please get a copy. It covers a lot of the issues that you may want to know about quality research, especially those who are in Asia. Even those who are outside of Asia, there's a lot of things here that you can learn from. You won't regret that. But I hope for our audience, you were able to pick up a number of practical strategies. Basically, the bottom line we are talking about here, let's not just stick only to what is in the guidelines, the procedures of the university, or what we read in the textbook. That's a good start, but let's go beyond that when it comes to qualitative research ethics, because we will usually come across certain things that were never taught in the qualitative research class, things that you have never read about, and you have to take the decision. And again, I love, and I'm going to give you your concluding thought, Dr. Maria. I love what Dr. Maria said, that humanity, we should be driven by humanity. What is the most human thing to do? The right human thing to do, because there are also bad things humans do, but what is the right human, the best human action to do in this case, and let that drive what you are doing. Dr. Maria, your closing statement.
Well, 2 practical points. If you have a question when you're watching this later, I'll circle back. I'm part of this group and try and answer through there, and I know Dr. Safari will also. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Safari to post his reference. He has an article on ethics that is very helpful. And so sometimes these more distilled versions are easier to consume. And then just the reminder that when we're thinking about entering the research relationship with humility and to enhance the dignity, what is dignity for one person is different for another. So when in doubt, ask the research participants themselves or people around them from their direct culture. And so when in doubt, ask them and don't assume that we necessarily know. So thank you so much for asking me to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. Again, we will have other sessions coming up in the months to come. This is not, I don't have like a regular every 2 weeks or every month. When I have time and I have somebody who has really a good topic, that's when we have that. So watch out for the next one. It will be at the beginning of July, but I shall post it here. Thank you so much for coming. Let's keep interacting here, post questions here or comments, or share some resources here on qualitative research so that we can all continue learning from one another. You take care, everyone. Dr. Maria, thank you so much for being with us today. Okay, I have just stopped the live streaming.